Welcome to Something to Talk About from the Bainbridge Island Senior Community Center. We're sponsored by Fieldstone Memory Care of Bainbridge Island, which offers innovative and compassionate care, and they're accepting residents. To learn more, call 360-689-4314 to schedule a tour of Fieldstone's beautifully appointed apartments on Rolling Bay. Also, I'd like to acknowledge that we're on the ancestral homeland of the Coast Salish people, specifically the Suquamish tribe, the people of the clear salt water. We honor them and are grateful for their hospitality. Today, we're going to talk about gardening, as we do every month at about this time. And Anne Lovejoy is with us. Thank you so much, Anne, for sharing your expertise.
You are so welcome, Reed. It's my pleasure. I wanted to talk a little today about the Pollinator Garden, which has been really popular. If any of you have been, I know some of you have been to the Senior Center most recently, you may have noticed the recent planting we did last Earth Day across down by the street, a great big curve of planting that's in full bloom now and has been for quite a while. That is a pollinator garden that was designed specifically to attract all kinds of bees, not just honeybees, but native bees and other pollinators as well. There's even a few things that are kind of night bloomers that attract night flying moths, and even some others that are specifically attractive to hummingbirds, which is really fun because we get a whole gamut. Like when I sit out and do, when I'm weeding in there and pulling the things I don't want, I'm noticing how many different kinds of bees there are of just visiting that simple little patch. And I wanted to talk a little about the kinds of flowers that pollinators like and about the way to make good habitat for them. But I'm also inviting you all to have your questions. Like, go ahead and put your hand up or put something in the chat if you have something specific you'd like me to address. But I did want to start off by just talking a little about the kinds of flowers that bees particularly like and why. So one of the things I think a lot of people do know that bees don't see the color red very well. They do see ultraviolet, which people do not. But one thing they're really, really good at is seeing the difference between a light and dark contrast. And as my eyes get funkier, I really appreciate that contrast piece myself, because that's kind of how I see things. In fact, once I was asked to design a garden for someone who is colorblind, and what that turned out to mean was really thinking about contrasts of shape and form and texture, but also of light and dark. It was really an interesting exercise and made me think, oh, maybe I'm seeing like a bee, right? That this might be how they see things. But one of the pieces I want to show you is the daisy form. This very simple open form is their most attractive because of that contrast issue, where you see that target zone really clear, right? When you look at the little daisies, you can see like that's about as clear a warning as, an attraction as you can have, right? So some flowers are a little more convoluted than that, but even these ones, this is Nigella, which is called Love in a Mist, and you can see how all that frilly bit, right? It's complicated, but boy, it's still a very clearly targeted pollen zone, right? And those are the ones that when they form seed pods, the seed pods look like these little inflated balloons, which are super cool. And if you just leave them alone and let them fall down and rot in place, you'll have Nigella for the rest of your life. It's a very happy self-seeder. And like a lot of self-seeders, the seeds don't need to be covered up in order to sprout. They are seeds of disturbance, and they'll sprout more readily when they get light and air. So that is one way to have more of that kind of flower. So if you look at these are sweet peas, and you can see their keels are different color from their petals, but these are a little more complex. And the bees that will be drawn to this especially are bumbles, and also hummingbirds like these, as well as they like hardy fuchsias too. And I meant to pick a hardy fuchsia and I forgot, but anyway, you can see they have to kind of wrestle their way in there to get to the good stuff. And that's what bumbles are really good for. They're kind of bulkier and a little more of a muscular kind of bee. And they can get right in. They love tubular flowers like hollyhocks and like foxgloves. You'll see the bumbles all over those. They're also very fond of the small tubular flowers like on our native, oh gosh, now anyway, skip. Don't you love it when you're like rolling along and you suddenly hit the wall of forgetting?
I'll just throw up a picture of a fuchsia.
There you go. Thank you. Yeah, hardy fuchsia. That's beautiful. But when you look at native plants, who's on them, you'll see the honeybees will come and visit a lot of native plants, and native bees will similarly visit a lot of things that are not native here. So there's a pretty common misconception that if you want to attract native bees, you can only have native plants. And really, the good news is that's not true. Most of them are generalists that are happy to just take whatever they can get wherever they find it. In fact, some of the most attractive flowers in the whole garden are going to be things like oregano, which is, here's some oregano. I have about a dozen kinds, and in the garden out front of the senior center, you can see there's at least 6 or 7 kinds of oregano. They look really quite different, actually. Some are white, some are pink, some are purple, some are big flowered, some are tall, some are tiny. Oregano is one of those extremely diverse families. And the cool part is they're all excellent pollinator plants, and they're tough as nails. So you can line a driveway, a sunny driveway, with different kinds of oregano, and they'll chase out the weeds, and you can run over them and they don't really care that much. They'll bounce right back. That's my kind of plant, right?
Yes, that sounds perfect.
Kind of is, right? Very forgiving. Another thing a lot of bees will like is, and I don't know if you can see this so well, but a plant with umbel, this is fennel. And you can see it's loaded with pollen right now. They've all been pollinated, the teeny tiny flowers on each of these little florets. And they are visited by bees, as well as things like hoverflies and tiny little insects that you wouldn't think would even notice these things were here, but they do. A lot of them have.
It's a kind of fennel.
Yeah, this is a fennel blossom, and that's fennel pollen, which you can pay a ton for at the health food department if you want to, or you can go out on your own fennel plant and shake it on a piece of paper and do whatever it is you do with it. It's supposed to be super healthy. I don't know. I know that bees really like it. You can watch them get on one of these fennel plants and then load up their little, they have like pantaloons that they stuff with pollen, and they get so heavy with the pollen, they start to take off, and they're like, whoa, wobbly for a little minute there. These are very pollen-rich plants. So if you have some fennel and dill, things like that, these are umbelliferous plants. Queen Anne's lace is another one that they would love, and that's in the carrot family. Also very, very heavy pollen producer. So those are great ones to make sure that you let them go to seed and ripen all the way through. The birds will come and eat the seeds and scatter the seeds, and the seeds will make sure you still have fennel and dill next year too, right? They're also very easy to grow from just letting them. I like plants that allow benign neglect. I think that's a great principle. One of the interesting things about, Laura and I were just talking a minute ago about how the bees humming is a very soothing, comforting sound, a lot like a cat. And it is that middle C, that's where they hum. And that middle C is a tone that releases pollen. And so sometimes you'll see them come down to a plant, like tomatoes especially, and they'll do their little dance and get their wings going, and they'll vibrate at middle C, and you'll see the pollen shed and tumble down, and then they can collect it. It's pretty great. And the other thing that I think is kind of fun is that bees groom each other like cats. If you've ever watched a pair of cats that are friends, they'll take turns licking each other and grooming each other, and they'll put out a paw. And bees do the same thing. They're very hygienic, very clean and tidy, and they make sure no dirt or gunge gets in their nest, because of course they have babies to protect, right? So they do a lot of cleaning and grooming before they go back into the hive. And those are social bees. But most of our native bees, we have about 600 species of native bees in Washington state. There are about 4,000 species in the country, but we have about 600 here and nobody knows exactly how many, because they're always finding new ones. A lot of them are pretty small, but none of them are really what you could call social bees. They're all pretty much solitary bees. Many of them are ground nesting. And one of the reasons that when you make a pollinator garden, you have to be very careful about not over grooming it, because many of them are ground nesters, and most of them will only travel 300 to 500 feet in their whole life. That's as far as they will go to forage. Honeybees can go several miles, but most of the solitary bees, the native bees, don't. And so if you want them to come back, and they will, and make your garden their home and return year after year, you have to make it a haven, a safe haven, which means you can't scrupulously tidy. Raking and digging can actually destroy their nests, of course. And so instead, you want to just get into the more passive mulching pattern. So when you begin one, you plant whatever you want to plant and put a layer of compost on top. And then I like to dress that with a layer of wood chips, not bark, but wood chips, which do a whole bunch of different things. They protect the soil from evaporation. They help shade out weeds. They provide a lot of habitat for little creatures. And the solitary bees will very happily make their home in the soil in your garden. But since it's really important, if you're making a haven, that you not periodically disrupt the haven. So you would not use a blower on it. You would not rake it. You would not haul everything out and just, turn it into compost. Instead, you really let stuff sit, and you have to let it sit over the winter, because I was asked the other day by a kid, what did mason bees do before we had straws? And I thought, what a great question, because of course, for thousands and thousands of years, possibly even a million years, there were no straws on this planet. But they will nest by choice in a hollow stem of a dying grass, or in a crack, or in the ground, and make their own little burrows. Some bees will actually instead of really making nests, they make like leafcutter bees. If you have roses especially, you might notice little round holes about that big cut out of the leaves of your roses. And that is leafcutter bees at work. And what they're doing is they make little capsules, which they put an egg, and then they put in some aphids, and then a little dab of mud, and then another egg, some more aphids, and a dab of mud. And then they seal the whole thing up, and it looks like like a horse pill. And they're maybe as long as one digit of your thumb, but more like your little finger, maybe. And you'll see those sometimes in the garden, just under the soil. And those are their nests, essentially. So you don't want to gush them or squish them, right? You want to make sure you leave them intact so that you can encourage more growth. Reed.
I'm wondering how deep or shallow a strip I might be able to start with to make one of these habitats. In other words, could I get away with something that's just, say, a couple to 3 feet deep, and then like a strip along the side, like you were talking about my driveway? Is that enough space for these guys to get settled?
You'd be amazed. There are places where there's garden cracks kind of that are about 6 inches wide, and they are full. What really they depend on is access, fodder, something to gather, and safety. And if the weedy patch along the side of your fence is probably full of critters that you don't even know are there, that's heaven for them. And some people call it their bug bank, that you're actually creating a bank where you can provide habitat, safety zones, and full of weeds, which weeds are, of course, many of them native plants or imported, but all of them are favorites of insects, which is why they're so prolific, right? If nobody liked them, there wouldn't be any seed production, but there is, which shows you that those kind of plants that we consider trash are actually very, very popular with a lot of creatures, for pollinators, and also often for birds, which like the seeds later as follow on. But yeah, if you look at that strip in the garden in the senior center, each bed of it is no wider. Some of them are about 2 feet wide, and some of them are about almost not quite 3 feet wide. But those are plenty big enough, any of those by themselves. And maybe you could start with a patch 3 by 5, right? Doesn't have to be enormous. The bigger it is, of course, the more you can serve, right? And the more bees and you'll attract. And that's really the fun part for me, is when my kids were little, I got involved with a fellow called Brian Griffin up in Bellingham, who was the first person in Washington to sell orchard mason bee kits. And he was a retired engineer who got into bees. Engineers tend to be people who like to try things and keep doing them and experiment. And he noticed these little teeny tiny wasps going into a crack in his siding of his house. And later he saw that when he was placing the siding, he saw that there had made a little nest. So he started putting blocks of wood in his backyard, and he would drill each chunk of wood with a different size drill bit and then mark on it 1/16 or 1/8 or 1/2, whatever it was, right? And he got the most interesting results because everything he put out got filled by something. And he was blown away. And he said, he wrote this wonderful, we used to write back and forth. And he wrote me this great letter saying, I just did a 1/16 inch drill bit and saw that it was immediately filled up with these little tiny wasps. And I realized that those are the parasitic wasps that they bite aphids, but they don't kill them. They paralyze them and they put them in with their eggs. They lay their little eggs, put the aphids that they just paralyzed in there to be food for the eggs when they hatch, put a little mud. Then this whole thing, just like the other bees do, but even smaller on the tiniest scale. And I thought, and he said they'll put 20 to 60 aphids in each little egg slot. And I thought that man has spent way too much time sitting there watching his wall. But what a cool way to learn, right? And he was one of the people, he wrote a book called The Humble Bumblebee. That's really cute. I think it's still in print. And another one about the orchard mason bee. And he was one of the first people to recognize that orchard mason bees are maybe 10 times more effective at pollinating than honeybees are. But because their foraging area is only 300 to 500 feet at the most, you have to put mason bee houses every 300 feet in your orchard. But when he started doing that, pollination picked up a lot and so he was working with agricultural agents and making sure the farmers knew that. And that was when they were trucking, they would truck huge semi trucks full of beehives and take them to all the orchards, but the honeybees are not as good at it. And if the farmers could simply put up mason bee houses and change them out with straws every year, they got it for free and they didn't have to pay for the trucking fees, right? Or pay for the loss of those bees when nearby neighbors sprayed. Mason bees are only out for about 10 to 12 weeks. So they have a very limited season, and it's one where not too many other things, there's not much spraying going on at that time. So they're usually not going to be wiped out by somebody's accidental overspray, if that makes sense. But all those, the solitary bees don't make a lot of honey. Bumblebees do a little bit, and they're kind of semi-social in that bumblebees will make, actually it's really adorable. A queen bumble, when she's getting ready to hatch out her babies, she makes a little nest and she makes this big blob of pollen and wax, because wax is made from pollen and nectar. And she'll make a blob of that and lay her eggs in it. And then she makes a little cup out of the same waxy stuff, and she'll bring in nectar. She basically goes and fills herself up with nectar and then barfs it into the cup, but okay, never mind. And then she'll sit there and warm the eggs with her tummy. So she sits on the blob where the eggs are and warm them with her tummy and just reach over like a housewife watching TV and eating bonbons. She'll help herself to a little nectar, and her warm tummy, because they're fuzzy, bees are fuzzy, and it keeps the eggs warm enough. And as they begin to hatch, they can eat their way out of that pollen saturated wax. I mean, is that super cute? I just think it's adorable. But when you start to learn things like that, you're much more appreciative of the sort of amazingness of the world around us that you would never notice. You would never see this. I'm very grateful for a lot of the super geeky scientists who do take the time to to learn these things. One of the most interesting things I've seen about bumbles came from someone who is a naturalist who takes care of 500 bluebird houses in a big reserve in the Midwest. And she said that the bumblebees often will make their egg masses in the bluebird houses, but she has to remove them very carefully and put them somewhere else because they'll actually sting the bluebirds. And usually bumbles are very gentle and they won't, but if somebody's disturbing their nest, of course, like any parent, they'll protect their baby.
So is it useful for us to, I remember hearing a lot of people putting together those mason bee blocks in their backyard. In addition to just making a nice habitat, we could sort of make the environment more pleasant for mason bees?
Yeah, and one of the pieces of that, of course, is the benign neglect piece, which is very important principle of natural gardening. It's funny because I have a pea patch at Eagle Harbor Church, and I recently discovered that there are some of the older gardeners who are horrified by my pea patch because I mulched with leaves and then put some compost on top of that, but you can still see the leaves even now. Uh-oh. And I got into a conversation with someone who was sort of saying, well, you know, your place is pretty much of a mess. I said, yeah, nature likes a mess. And what you see here, you know, you should be grateful to me because look at all the bees and other pollinators that are on my flowers. And they're things like parsley is in bloom, and parsley is an umbilical that looks a lot like this, covered with little insects, right? And then they'll go and pollinate other things too. I let the kale go to bloom and form seeds and sow themselves so that I have a regular supply of different kinds of kale. You don't have to let all the seeds mature, but always a branch or two to make sure that they perpetuate themselves, right? And I let plants mingle because a lot of plants prefer to mingle rather than be grown this far apart. What happens when plants gently overlap like this is they actually form a bubble of moist air at the surface of the soil. And that moist air is beneficial not only for the plants and plant roots, but also for the life of the soil itself. The soil biota does much better in soil that's a little bit moist than in a parched, baked surface of, you know, when you just grow your plants spaced apart with no mulch between them, and it's just bare earth, which is disturbed periodically by weeding, that top half inch or inch becomes almost dead because there's nothing there to keep the soil alive.
Like
right?
leaves.
Like leaves, like compost, like different kinds of mulch. Or like I was saying, if you do a layer of mulch and compost and chips, which I also did in one area, and they said it was so messy because you couldn't tell where the path was. And it's like, well, path doesn't have plants growing out of it. So I think you can actually tell. But it disturbs people's sense of what's attractive and right. But it's that tidiness that is so, it's all about the hand of man. And this goes way back in Western culture, and not only Western culture, but it's like that we dominate nature and that nature is under control, and it's not safe or attractive if it isn't under control. I mean, think about those gardens in Europe where everything is clipped hedges and mowed lawns for hundreds of years, right?
The Garden Corps of Engineers.
Yeah, it's really an interesting thing when you think of it that way. Nature does not need us to be in combat with us, which God knows we are. But instead, any little piece of land that you can nurture will, you know, for one thing, you want carbon drawdown. Well, nothing draws down carbon better than plants. They're like straws that suck carbon down and store it in the ground. But they store it a whole lot better if there's an active layer of biota in the soil. So every time somebody digs that blow dryer and blasts the crap out of their soil in their garden, they've just destroyed the life of their soil for that vital top inch or so. So instead, layer, 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 put the compost down, put those chips down, and coarse wood chips are fine, especially in areas you don't go into a lot. But medium ones are kind of look a little more deliberate. But as we saw at the senior center, areas that got mulched like that and chipped like that, I haven't hardly had to water at all. But in the back where we would put in some new gardens and there was areas where we ran out of chips, those are thirsty plants and they don't hold the water as well. So you can think of those chips as providing, you know, sheltering, preventing evaporation, keeping the wind, because it's a very windy site. And actually all over the island, it's usually quite windy, and that will suck moisture out of the soil too. So those chips will provide another layer of kind of insulation for the soil. But making good habitat is often simply a matter of getting out of there, leaving it alone.
So I want to open this up. If you came with a question or a comment either about this topic or anything else, please share how it's going in your garden right now.
Yeah, Sheila's the only person I know who's actually got tomatoes on her plant. And I think it's partly because you're up on the 3rd story, right? And hot air rises. So your garden is up there warmer than most people's who's on the ground and probably shaded a lot more too.
Well, actually, the plants that, the stupus that I have, that I have, I got from Bainbridge Gardens, and it already had 2 tomatoes coming on it. So I that's a bit of a cheat, but at the same time, and I've had the 2 of them, I've already eaten those 2, and I have one out there that's getting a little bit red around the edges, and I'm thinking, yes. But I've got probably, I'll have enough and to do the dry tomatoes in the fall, because that's the best part of that whole thing. And you could talk about that a little bit, which I think it's a good reminder.
Well, you were doing oven roasting, weren't you?
I wrote roasting them. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think this is when you have a glut, which this is not going to be the glut year necessarily, but you might go to the farmer's market and buy a box of tomatoes or something. You know, most of those tomatoes are being grown in greenhouses, by the way. It's not you. This is just a very difficult year for a lot of fruiting things. For one thing, early in the spring, it was very windy and cold, and a lot of the early blossoms, like some of the plums and cherries, got really beat up and blown apart before they could get pollinated. Pollinators were not out because it was too cold. And so unless you were in a very sheltered area, some people with a lot of wind shelter actually did get fairly decent pollination, but usually I'm hearing most people are saying they didn't get anything like what they usually do. And for tomatoes, woof, tough year. But anyway, if you have a bunch of them, you just can cut them in half. I rub a sheet pan with, I use avocado oil because it has a very high burn point, and it has a very unobtrusive, almost buttery flavor, which I quite like. And you put them cut side up on this pan, and you can sprinkle them with a little sea salt or herb salt if you want, and then just roast them gently at 225 until, it depends on the stage you want them, but I usually do them for a couple hours. And then you can freeze that and add it to soups and sauces and so forth later on. And it's fabulous, really delicious.
Oh, they're so good. Oh, they're still good. I only take a little bit at a time. It's really good. Yeah, I still have a few up there anyway. Mm-hmm.
I have a dedicated ice maker, shape, what do you call those things?
Ice tray.
Yeah. I'm having a tough day. And you take this ice cube tray that has a cover, and I put things like pesto in that, and then pop them out when they're frozen and put them in a bag. And then you can just use a little at a time. And you can do that too with things like, if you take that roasted tomatoes and puree it, and you can put that in a ice cube tray and freeze them like that, just so you get a little at a time, and you just drop a little into especially if you're cooking for 1 or 2 people and not a big family, it's nice to have a small amount to liven things up a little bit. I put that in when I make pizza sauce, for instance. It gives it a real nice richness. I've also been making herb salts because this is the time. So I made yesterday, I was harvesting garlic in my untidy garden and got several dozen huge, beautiful cloves of garlic. And I'm braiding them to let them dry. So you braid the stems together and let them dry out and air dry. That kind of cures them. And then I do grow keepers mostly. So they'll last really nicely. But I took a couple cloves of garlic and a cup of rosemary, trimmed rosemary. I just stem it and put that with 2 cups of salt. That kosher salt is mined, so it doesn't have plastic bits in it. And unfortunately, sea salt anymore often has a lot of plastic in it, which is a criminal. But anyway, that's what it is. So 2 cups of salt. I grind the whole thing up in my magic squeeze and managed to remember not to wash it, because what you do, you grind it all up in your food processor, and then you put it out on a baking sheet as, in a thin layer that's about the same thickness, and bake that at 225 for about 15 minutes or so until it gets a crust on it. And then let it cool, put it back in the food processor and grind it up again. And that stabilizes it so that it won't mold or mildew, and it still retains its fragrance. If it's sealed in a little jar, it retains the scent and the flavor for up to 2 years. Pretty great. Makes a fabulous gift too. People are thrilled to get. You can make basil salt, you can make rosemary, garlic, lemon, salt, or what, have really a good time doing. I make a kind of a mix of oregano and a little lavender and thyme, and do that too, which is really delicious. It's really fun. And this is the season. I do almost cup for cup usually of something that I'm going to add additive to salt, grind it, and that makes it much stronger. It's the stuff that you buy at the grocery store for $15 a little bottle, because it's the good stuff, right? Anybody else got a question? I know what I was going to tell you about the sweet peas. So like a lot of annuals, sweet peas are geared to, if you let them go to seed, they'll stop blooming. But the more you pick them, the more they'll bloom, because their imperative of all annuals is to make set seed and ensure the next generation. So I always pick them every day, and they smell so amazing. And every day there's more and more and more and more. But this time of year, they're just starting to get fewer on a stem and not as big. So I start to let a few of them go to seed. And what I find, the ones that I'm picking this year just self-sowed. Some of those pods got ripe and burst and fell to the ground. And they're volunteers that just come back year after year after year. So that's another benefit of the benign neglect gardening technique that
Yeah, this is a year where the sweet peas were very late because of that cold start, for sure.
Well, what I noticed though was that many of mine had sowed themselves last year, and
Right.
they were young starts, and where they were under mulch, they came through that cold. But some of the ones that were younger plants that were put out, they got killed. So,
But even those probably that showed up a little later than you might have expected. But
Yeah.
they're still blooming, and this is usually like a little late. Laura, you had maybe a question or comment? Or
Yeah, sure. I'm just loving all this. I might have to get a food processor at some point, because I've managed without one, but now I want to
I'm
make
still
these herb
I'm
salts.
still using my osterizer.
Okay. Yeah. And I just do a lot of chopping and whatever else, but, I've got a garden plot, and we probably, when we planted things, I thought there was plenty of space, but I've got one pepper that's doing well, and it's I don't know if I'll get any peppers, but at least like the plant looks like decent. I've got another pepper that apparently is getting it's getting too shaded in by lettuce and squash, and I've been trying to take the lettuce and create like a little pepper moat for it, but it's really sad. Is it like hopeless? Do I just kind of just have a little ceremony and say, thank you for trying, I'm so sorry, but like, is it hopeless, or is there something I can do to try to bring this poor pepper back?
yeah, there is. And, in garden terms, it's probably late May.
Yeah.
So, I'd water it and feed it.
Yeah.
And offer it. There's that Dr. Earth has a really good kind of granulated, it's a scratch-in fertilizer. And so you just kind of put it around the plant. And, the roots, the active roots, feeder roots of the plant are going to be where the drip line is, not necessarily right around the stem. But so if the plant is this fat, you kind of make a big circle about 4 inches wide, make a band of that stuff and just scratch it and lightly water it in, and make sure that, that it doesn't get encroached on, because they do like good air exchange. That's important for them. But that ought to help. Like feeding is always a good plan. And, even though it hasn't rained for a while, it was a very rainy year. So a lot of nutrients do kind of get washed out. So feed it every couple weeks for the next month or so. And that should help.
Okay. I've been using soil soup from, Len sells it at the Dahlia cart, and, doing a little bit of that.
But so soil soup is something different. It's not fertilizer as such.
Okay.
What it does, and it does this great, is when you spray a leaf with the soil soup, it actually fills, every leaf has about 20 opportunities or slots on it for different kinds of bacteria and things to grow. So when you spray it with the soil soup, they enter those slots and take up those spaces. Then it makes them more resilient if fungus moves in, or if a mold or mildew moves in. And this is a bad year. I have seen sooty mold on everything from camellias to plum trees, and lots of mildews and molds, and all over the place, because it's been such a challenging weather year. And the cool, long, prolonged spring meant a lot of things just didn't get the boost they usually do. And so they weren't able to outgrow some of those pathogens. If you have mold or powdery mildew, especially on squash plants, you can actually spray with like a 10% solution of skim milk and water, 10% milk to 90% water, and spray that on, and it will give it a calcium kick, which really helps protect those big hairy leaves. And it also makes the rind of things like winter squash a little denser and thicker and makes them cure better. Our soils here are rich in a lot of nutrients, but they're kind of low in calcium. And that's why we don't have native land snails, only native water snails. All the snails that we pick out of the garden over and over are imports from usually off commercial plants from other states where they do have more calcium in their soil, but we don't. So yeah, your plants can use a boost. And you know, tomatoes like that too. A lot of things do. So you can give it a little, and you want to use the skim milk because you don't want to put fat on your plants because that actually globs up the leaf apertures. Doesn't help them.
Yes. Well, I've been, you know, since your intervention at one of the other sessions, I've been really more careful watering to not get all those delicate leaves wet.
Yeah, it's hard. And, you know, some years it doesn't really matter if they get wet, if then they dry out properly, but they don't sometimes. And so that's been one of the issues. But powdery mildew also comes from dry roots. And that's the other piece that, you know, if I know a month ago, I started saying water, 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 and people are like, it's still raining. And it's like, it might still be raining, but it's not usually raining enough to make the soil really stay wet. And often around here by May, the soil is really pretty dry. You know, it may seem to be wet on the surface, but if you dig down even a few inches, it's really dry. And, you know, even though we had a wet spring, we are still in drought as a state. We're not in an emergency, like extreme drought situation anymore. We got off that list a couple months ago, but we're still in considered drought comparatively. You know, if you look over 20, 40, 50 years, we are in a drought state. So watering is really important, but again, watering the soil and not the leaves as much as possible.
Okay. And just coming back, can I put the same fertilizer on the peppers, tomatoes, or do some of them like different things? Are they picky eaters?
Nah, most of them are not picky at all. They're tomatoes, especially, like pretty much anything. They're kind of gross feeders. The more you feed them, but not, I mean, to a point. But every couple of weeks is a good rule of thumb. And anything in a container, like a pot or a hanging basket, those you definitely want to feed every couple of weeks because they really do get drained out. You know, that water rushes through and carries away a lot of the water soluble nutrients. So you have to replenish those pretty often. But yeah, those all-purpose fertilizers, they're not super high. They're not like Peter's 20-20-20 or something, which is not a good thing for edibles. And it's wasteful because most of that just gets washed out into the water stream and that's more pollution, right? But low number stuff, like those good, fairly balanced fertilizers, they're great. Dr. Earth is a good one. I like that one a lot.
Dr. Earth, okay. All right, making a note.
Anita, do you want to unmute and comment? Thanks.
Yeah, I have a question about growing corn. Is it possible? I mean, I moved out from the Midwest where the corn was just to die for. But and my little grandson would love to grow corn. There's something, I think it's called glass. It's beautiful just as a plant. I don't even know if it's edible, but it has striped leaves and then it has beautiful kernels that are purple and, you know, different colors of, and what I'd love to try that, but the season seems so short. Do I have to start inside or what's the trick? Is there?
Well, some years you can grow corn here, but corn requires, you know, because it's wind pollinated, you have to plant corn in blocks. And the smallest practical size is about a 4x4 patch, and bigger, of course, is much, much better. And the problem, you know, with corn too is like knee high by the 4th of July. Well, this year, the 4th of July, we weren't even it was probably an inch high, right?
Yeah.
It's just too cold. Now that isn't always true, but it often is. And so the best corn gardens are going to be big, open, sunny gardens with good drainage. And often you might find you can start them indoors, especially in a cold year, and then you have to kind of get them out in stages. Like you can't just take them from a greenhouse and stick them in the cold soil and expect it to be happy. But yeah, and that glass corn is actually a dent corn. So it's an old heritage corn that was used, that still is used for cornmeal, for grinding. But it's really decorative, and you can always grow. Like I've grew 3 or 4 of them. I put some in the Waypoint a few years back because they're so pretty. They're beautiful, and they really are amazing looking. But they're not yummy like you'd slather it with butter and take a bite and go, yeah. It's sort of more like what people used to call cow corn in Ohio, which is, a kind of corn that's grown specifically for nutrient content for ruminant animals, not people. But, here in the Northwest, if you want to try to grow corn, definitely grow some of that just for fun. But the kinds that are going to be the most successful are actually going to be the kinds that you get from, I would say, Ed Hume seeds, because he has a lot of organic seed and stuff, but he also has been really good about growing stuff for the Pacific Northwest. And Territorial's good too, but they're more, they're down in Oregon, where the land of real summer. And so a lot of theirs will do well in Oregon, but not always quite so well up here, and especially on our little island.
Right. Or you could move to Eastern Washington, I suppose.
Yeah, you could. And actually, they're thrilled. They're getting more rain than usual. And the farmers are really happy because the rain is jumping over us and hitting Eastern Washington this year. And we're going to have bumper wheat crops, which is pretty great. But I like watching weather and seeing what it does and where it goes. It's really quite interesting. But as far as the corn goes, you're going to have better luck with some of the smaller eared types. And those super sweet corns are often quicker. They mature fast and have a smaller ear, and those are good ones. I'd give it a try for sure, but not this year. It's a little late.
Well, my main goal is that as he's growing up, he learns where food comes from.
Yeah.
So even if we can't eat the corn that would be in the garden, at least he can see an ear of corn on the stalk, and make the connection. I think would be great.
Well, you might have fun growing some popcorn.
Oh, that's a great idea.
Right?
Yeah.
And you could also show him how in a lot of tribal regions in the Midwest and down in the South, people traditionally grew the 3 sisters, which would be squash, beans, and corn, and how the corn served as the beans could grow up the corn stalks, right? And that's a fun project for kids. My kids love doing stuff like that. And then the big squash leaves shade out the weeds at the base of the plants and trap moisture in the soil. So they're mutually beneficial, right?
Yeah, we can try that too. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, whenever you introduce a child to gardening and help them fall in love with plants, that's just such a huge gift to the future, to that kid and to the planet. Because, they always say you only protect what you love. And unless we bring kids into the garden and help them love it, they're not going to, right?
Right, definitely. Yeah.
What were you going to say?
Oh, we grew peas. This has been a strange spring for my family too. So I haven't been able to, with COVID coming and going in the families, I haven't been able always to get over there. There've been longer stretches, but we planted peas last fall and they came up. And then they looked really sad over the winter. This was an experiment for me because I don't know that much about vegetable gardening. And so I thought, I heard that they might winter over, and they did, but they didn't look like they were going to come back much this spring. And then all of a sudden they just took off. And I think they are still harvesting peas, and they're wonderful. But I think they might be called snap peas. We lost track of the packet that they came in, but to my surprise, you eat the pod as well as the peas,
Mhm.
And the bigger they get, the juicier and sweeter they are. They're not like snow peas. Are those snap peas?
Yeah, sugar snap peas or snap peas. Yeah, and they're delicious. And you know, my grandkids love those. And a lot of times, if you planted some of those pretty soon, you would get a fall crop. And you might this year. This might be a good year to try to do that because it's it's still fairly cool in the night, and that means that the roots can go deep, right? And they don't fry. But just water them really well, and you may well get a second crop. That would, and yeah, the snow peas often will winter over and produce early in the spring or late winter. And those are the kind of the flat ones with the seeds are just really small.
Yeah.
But the sugar pod peas have really fat, really sweet pods. You're right. And they're
Yeah, yeah, they get fat. The pods get fatter and fatter. And
Yep.
just, yeah, I'm just amazed. Now, can I save seeds from them?
Yes, but to do that, you leave them on the vine and mark them with a marker or something so you remind yourself not to pick it, and let it get absolutely brown and brittle, and it will start to split open by itself. You know, the zipper kind of, and then when the seeds are ripe, they're usually kind of gray green
Okay.
or pale, sort of dusty green looking, but they'll be quite hard. But they don't ripen properly unless they're still on the vine. So it's one of those things where you have to let it be messy for a while.
Yeah. Well, I liked hearing benign neglect.
Yeah.
That's a good, I like that term.
You can also tell everybody that your garden is a haven, a safe haven for native pollinators.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank
So I have some blackberry dangerous part in the back of my backyard that I keep trying to cut down the blackberries. And I'm trying to think about things that I could plant there that would sort of help push them out, help me in the effort to overcome them. Obviously, the only thing to keep doing is to keep cutting them down, and eventually they won't keep coming up, I'm guessing, outside of inviting goats in.
Well, there's actually a technique to controlling blackberries, and that is you got to mow at least 4 times a year. Or when I say mow, or cut them by hand in a small patch like that. But the farmers know, like, but the timing of that is really important, because what you want to do is starve the large roots, right? They have big storage roots. And so in the spring, we know the fresh growth comes up and it's pretty upright, and then it kind of, the leaves will spread out and they're starting to turn from that tender green to kind of a darker green and getting matte instead of glossy. That is the point at which they become photosynthetic and are starting to pull down nutrients and store them back in the root. So that's your first cut. And that is usually April or May, right? And then the second cut is usually right about now, June or July. And then a third cut's going to be September. And then the fourth cut is usually like November. And so what you do is you let it grow enough to be using the nutrients out of that root. You're depleting them. Does that make sense? And you want to wait until they do that flip thing and turn matte and dark green, and then cut all the way to the ground. And the other thing that's really valuable is the smother mulching, which involves really deep layers of the wood chips. Kitsap County did some studies quite a while ago now, and they were working in park areas trying to eradicate ivy that had been growing for decades. And they found that 8 to 12 inch layer of smother mulch chips, coarse bark chips, not bark, wood chips, excuse me. The coarse wood chips will smother out about 80% of the ivy in about 3 months. And then the ground is also softened and opened because of the protection of those chips, and which lets the biota come back to life, and the worms start doing the digging for you, and the soil is much easier to get into. And then you can go back in and selectively, where you still see the shoots, rake away the bark, go back in there with your mattock or a hori-hori, a garden fork or whatever, and actually dig those roots out as best as you can. And it takes a while. It's not like it's going to happen in 1 year, but you can get rid of them.
And then good things to plant in their place are like maybe Oregon grape or
you may see a lot of things
lupin?
coming back, right? A lot of
just on its own.
Yeah. a lot of times native plants that were under there in the first place are still under there lurking. And when you remove the blackberries, you start to see things like Oregon grape coming back up. Sometimes there's ferns and stuff like that. The thing is, the blackberries are allelopathic. They can actually put out a toxin and kill off their competitors. So they're not good sharing plants, but you will see things like cedars will come up through them sometimes, or alders. But when, yeah, Oregon grape is a good one. There's lots of different sizes of Oregon grape, big and short. If it's going to be shady up there, that's a really good choice. Some of the tougher plants, like those epimediums that we have in the back at the senior center, those are really good ground covers that are very tough and run over a lot of other smaller, they block out weeds very effectively because they have a very tight knitted root system, and they're very tolerant of shade. And those you just want to mow once a year, or I just cut them by hand, and then you see them bloom in January, February. They have beautiful flowers like birds on a wire, and then the leaves refurbish and they're good all through the winter. It's one of my favorite ground covers for shade.
All right, and it's fun to say epimedium.
Epimedium, right? Like epimaximum. It's also called bishop's hat, I think.
Judith, do you have a comment or question?
No, can I ask a question that's got nothing to do with anything you've talked about?
Sure.
I just bought a dwarf ginkgo plant, shrub, and I've repotted it in a pot from the container I bought it in, and I'm trying to decide where the best place to plant it is. I believe it needs sun and fairly dry soil, but does it get along with like connect or stuff like that?
Sure. And they do like full sun for the most part, and they don't necessarily, they don't want to be in a swamp, but they don't want to be dry.
No. I don't have any swamps.
Well, if some people have areas that stay kind of boggy, soggy all year, but that's not good. And especially for the first 2 or 3 years, you'd want to make sure that you gave them summer water to get them through until their root system is really established. But
so how often would one water something like that? Because I've never had a ginkgo before, and I've always wanted one. And I didn't want a tall one, I wanted a dwarf one.
Well, remember that the tall ones are very tall. And so the dwarf one,
that's why I didn't get it.
Yeah.
We've got too many tall trees.
The dwarf one is still going to be pretty good size, like probably 18, 20 feet.
I was told that it was going to branch outwards rather than upwards.
Well, it will do both, but and the thing is, a lot of times the height that's given on the plant label is actually the height that the plant is probably going to be at about 10 years. And honestly, this is really true. Those plant labels are made with that kind of information because the assumption is that in 10 years you will have moved, or the plant will have died, or you will have died. I'm not even kidding.
I will have died. Yeah.
Yeah. And so here in the Northwest, things grow larger and longer than because we usually do, or traditionally we have had a much milder winter and longer springs. And those are good for root growth, right? Cool, wet months.
So how often should I water it?
Well, I would say you'd start in May and water it every couple of weeks, especially if it's very dry. If you're getting an inch of water a week from rain, then you don't need to. But like so many growing things, for the first few years, they really are dependent on you to help them get their roots properly established. So every couple of weeks in a hot, dry year, should there ever be such a thing again?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm supposed to prune it once in a while, I believe.
Well,
I don't want it to get tall, very tall.
The thing about that is pruning is not really for size control. And so
is it for shape? It's very, very sweet right now. It's very pretty. But it's in a pot.
And it will certainly take off and be happier in the ground. But here's the thing, again, pruning for size control usually results in a distorted plant habit that's not really very attractive. But there's some really good pruners on the island. Ian Bentron is a good one. I don't know if you know him.
Yeah, he's not doing it. I've tried to get him to do my Japanese maple, and he did it last time and did an incredible job, but he told me he's been ill and he's not taking any more customers. So my maple tree is enormous and I've been desperately looking for somebody, but I can't find anybody. I called the lady at the Laughing Crow Farm, who apparently does it, but she's so busy with her vineyard and her farm, she doesn't have time to do maples at the moment. So the tree's just continuing to grow out of shape.
That is
very
hard.
sad.
Bainbridge Gardens
Yeah.
used to get Dave Dwyer in every year, and he's a wonderful pruner of maples, and he would do the ginkgo as well. So I'd call Bainbridge Gardens and ask him for Dave Dwyer's contact information, and if he's still doing that. He was younger, so I think he probably is. But he was
But Ian was marvelous.
Yeah, he's
He
really
did
good.
a beautiful job. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, we're down to just a couple minutes. It looks like Ace wants to get in here briefly. So
I had a brief comment about the ginkgo and specifically pruning it as kind of a topiary bonsai. Technically, it does denaturalize the plant, but that's my understanding of how they are actually kept with size control. It's, it's something very different. Obviously you don't have a natural plant once you've topped it over and over and over again and encouraged it to grow out instead of up. But it's my understanding that they're at least capable of that.
Oh, sure. But the thing about real bonsai is that they're usually in pots. And so root constriction and regular root pruning is also part of that. Because when you try to control a plant with pruning, most of the time, if the plant is in the ground, you're not pruning the roots as well. And the roots will go ahead and do what they think they need to do to make the plant be the size that they think it should be, right? It's like there's a cultural imperative in the plant. If it's supposed to be 20 feet, those roots are going to go out 20 feet or more, regardless of what you do to the top of it. But in true bonsai, the container has a lot to do with how well that, and it's a very amazing art form, but it is, I would say, really high maintenance. But yeah, no, it's great. Junko is
which is the opposite of benign neglect, which is where we're going to have to end it today. But thank you very much, Anne.
You're
As
welcome.
usual,